Out there in the sticks past the cornfields and the dirt roads, there's a lonely farmhouse sitting under a Wisconsin moon. The windows stay black no matter how hard you stare, and the smell of rot rides on the wind. And inside that house, there's a man. Not a monster, not yet. Just a quiet farmer, soft-spoken, polite, known around town for doing odd jobs and keeping to himself. But in that silence, something is festering, something planted in him by his mother long before the world knew his name. And when people start disappearing, when the dominoes start to fall and lead police cars to the Gein farm, the sheriff's men walk through that barn door and their flashlights hit what's hanging from the rafters, it's too late. The sickening truth hits them that this is not a horror movie. This is Plainfield, Wisconsin. This is real. Tonight, around this fire, we're not talking about Hollywood's idea of the boogeyman. No masks, no chainsaws, no glossy Netflix edits, no half-baked truths. This is the story that birthed all of them. Like and subscribe to this channel and saddle up. This is the Ed Gein story. Before he was ever known as the Butcher of Plainfield, before his name ever became the blueprint for movie killers, Ed Gein was a farm boy. Born in 1906 in the kind of cold that would make your lungs sting when you breathe. His world was small, a patch of land, a collapsing barn, and a family that never let the light in. Now, his mother, Augusta, ran the house like a church built on fear. Every sermon was about sin, and every lesson was about how women, except for her, were instruments of the devil. Ed and his older brother Henry weren't allowed to have friends, they weren't allowed to laugh, they weren't allowed to see the world, only her voice and the Bible. And his father George was the exact opposite. He was a drunk, beaten down by life and her scorn. And when Ed's father died, the house got even quieter, and Augusta's grip got tighter. Ed worshipped her. He hung on every word. She called him her good boy. But in 1945, Augusta Gein suffered a terrible stroke. It weakened her, but it didn't silence her. And for the first time, Ed saw the woman who ruled every inch of his world with an iron fist confined to a bed. And he tended to her himself. He cooked for her, he cleaned, he sat in the same chair night after night listening to her breathe. And a few months later, she was hit by a second stroke that finished what the first one started. Ed was there when her voice stopped. No screaming, no collapse, just the sound of everything going deathly still. He buried her in the Plainfield cemetery beside the husband she despised and then went back to the house. The locals said he took it quietly, but that wasn't true. He had simply turned all the noise inward. Ed sealed off his mother's sitting room and bedroom exactly as they had been. Curtains drawn, sheets smoothed, Bible on the table, no dust allowed, no disturbance. And these rooms, to Ed, were holy ground. The rest of the farmhouse was not. Newspapers piled high, dishes crusted, rats forming nests under the stove. The air went thick with mold and rot, enough to run any normal person out gasping for air. But Ed, he rotted with it. He sunk into it and wrapped himself in it like a warm blanket, becoming one with the shrine that he had built for his mother. Now, because the rest of the house had become completely unlivable, Ed moved his cot into the kitchen, the one place that he could keep a small fire going in the Wisconsin winters, and that's where he lived. Now, after Augusta died, people in town noticed Ed drifting. He would still do odd jobs, and he smiled politely, but his eyes looked distant. At night, his truck would putter down the county road toward the cemetery. He told his friends that he liked visiting his mother's grave to feel close to her. But as the truth would later reveal, Ed wasn't just visiting, he was digging. Quietly, carefully, under moonlight, choosing women who looked a little bit like his mother Augusta, pulling them from the earth where their grieving loved ones had laid them to rest in peace, and taking them to a new resting place of filth, fantasy, and depravity. And that was the shape that his grief took: a son trying to fill a house gone silent, a man trying to resurrect the only voice he had ever obeyed. And it was during that time that Ed Gein crossed the line from lonely farm boy to monster. Now, if you strip away the horror and the headlines, what's left of Ed Gein is something even sadder, even darker. A man who couldn't tell the difference between obsession and love. Psychiatrists called him a schizophrenic with necrophilic tendencies, but the truth is, those words are a little bit too clean for what was really happening. You see, Ed Gein was a man whose entire emotional world began and ended with his mother. She was his compass, his law, his God, and when she died, he didn't just lose her, he lost the only boundary he had ever had. And without Augusta, there was no voice telling him right from wrong, no shame, no restraint, and what he did after her death wasn't about violence for its own sake, it was about proximity. It was about trying to keep her presence alive the only way his fractured mind could understand, and that's why he chose women that looked like her, middle-aged and strong features. He chose resemblances that blurred together under the moonlight and his delusions, and when he exhumed the bodies, he later said that he wasn't trying to harm them, he thought of it as borrowing. You see, Ed Gein's brand of madness wasn't unique, but it was unusually pure. Men like him, ones who kill or desecrate in the name of obsession, they share one trait: a total absence of emotional development. They never grow beyond the point where their obsession began. And there are people that did similar things but still were different than the pathology of Ed Gein. Albert Fish, for example, he filled the void with pain and he believed that torment was communion. And Jerry Brudos, decades later, filled it with control, collecting women's shoes and undergarments like trophies. But Ed filled his with ghosts. He didn't want to dominate or destroy women, he wanted to be near them, to recreate his mother through them piece by piece. And that's what makes his story so uniquely disturbing. Because most killers seek power. Ed Gein sought comfort. And that's what makes people like him the most dangerous kind of monster, because they don't know that what they're doing is wrong. By 1947, the winters in Plainfield had grown long and silent. The townsfolk saw the same little truck rolling through town, headlights low, the driver's face unreadable, but nobody thought much of it. Ed Gein was still the man doing odd jobs, patching fences, keeping to himself. He was spending more and more nights at the cemetery where his mother was buried, and he told people he missed her, and that part was true. Police would later find obituary clippings in his jacket pockets of women who resembled his mother. And some claims even say that Ed would mark fresh graves in pencil on a little map that he kept hidden in the farmhouse, although this fact is not verified by any police reports. Now, during his time as a grave robber, sometimes he admitted that he only stood at the headstones, lantern light shivering in his hands, listening to the wind move through the pines, and other nights, he dug. He said that his grave robbing was during these blackout moments, and at times he would kind of wake up in the middle of it and realize what he was doing and abandon it altogether, but there were times where the blackout lasted until he had completed his task. And so night to night, it was just up to chance. Some nights he would stop halfway, and other times he worked until his shovel struck the wooden lid. Now, Ed's first confirmed exhumation happened in the Plainfield Cemetery between 1947 and 1949, and it was a woman who matched Augusta's features almost exactly according to the newspaper photograph, robbing her from the same graveyard where his mother lay and the same ground that Ed would drive past almost every day. And each visit blurred the line between memory and reality just a little more, until the cemetery felt less like a resting place and more like a storehouse for the pieces of a dream that he could not stop chasing. He read constantly: pulp magazines, medical journals, crime digests, articles about anatomy, cannibal cults, and headhunters. And those stories fed the same obsession that drove him to the cemetery: the idea that skin could be turned into something useful, and that death could be rearranged into some kind of company. Matter of fact, after his arrest, his examiners at Central State wrote that Ed viewed the body as a vessel that could be repurposed. He believed that if he could take his mother's form, he could feel close to her again. And that idea solidified after he read about a so-called sex change experiment in the 1940s, which he interpreted as proof that flesh could be altered to change identity. So in town, Ed kept his harmless reputation. At the tavern, he would drink root beer, and you could picture him telling offhand jokes and making the bartender laugh, just being your average Joe. He told ghost stories and talked about the Nazi war camp stories that he had read of and how they used artifacts from human remains to make lampshades and other trinkets, and he talked about how people waste good material. And everybody just thought that it was gallows humor, just farmhand talk. Nobody could have possibly conceived that Ed was literally waving a red flag and revealing an MO that needed to be taken seriously. Now, history and movie and TVs have kind of blurred Ed's reputation over the years with other serial killers like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, but here's the truth. Comparatively, Ed's true kill count was very low. And in fact, those two murders were more of an unfortunate consequence of his sickness, a byproduct. His satisfaction was not in killing itself like other serial killers. His satisfaction came in the intimacy that he experienced with the bodies after death. Now, Mary Hogan ran the tavern on Main Street, just a short walk from the feed mill. She was loud, broad shoulders, quick to laugh, and unashamed of the language that came out of her mouth. To Ed, she was everything that his mother had warned him about: coarse, worldly, and yet strangely magnetic. He would sit at the end of her bar, sipping root beer, listening to her tease the regulars. Neighbors remembered him staring at her hands, her jawline, the way that she commanded a room. And when his mother's sermons about wicked women echoed in his head, Mary's voice drowned them out. It was confusion disguised as fascination. And on December 8, 1954, the tavern closed early. Snow was falling, and a single .32 caliber shot cracked through the quiet streets. And by morning, there was blood behind the counter, an empty register, and no sign of Mary Hogan. The sheriff's deputies listed her as missing, and the town blamed drifters, hunters, and Ed joined in the talk at the cafe, shaking his head like everybody else. And when somebody joked that maybe he had hidden her away, he answered, "She's at my place now." And it would take 3 more long years for anyone to understand that that line wasn't a joke. After Mary Hogan disappeared, Gein's work shrank further. The farmhouse grew darker, the piles of magazines grew higher. He kept reading about anatomy, preservation, Nazi war trophies, the same material that had given him the ideas after his mother's death. He still helped neighbors and cashed small checks from odd jobs, but he was vanishing behind his own eyes. Psychiatrists later said that his first killing came when his nightly borrowing from graves was no longer easing the ache. And the truth is that Mary Hogan looked too much like his mother and sounded too much like temptation. The act, he told them, happened in a fog. He called it a mistake, a word that he repeated over and over. And 3 winters later, on November 16, 1957, the pattern returned with Bernice Worden. She was 58, a widow who had owned the local hardware store, and her son Frank was a deputy sheriff, a detail that would only matter after the fact. Ed had been in the hardware shop that week asking about antifreeze and a rifle, and he came back that Saturday morning and she wrote his name on the sales slip around 9:30. And by nightfall, the store was empty, the cash register was open, and Bernice was gone, and her son Frank Worden found the slip that said antifreeze, Ed Gein, written in her neat handwriting, and he knew where to go. The night had fallen hard over Plainfield by the time that the deputies had turned down Archer Road. The farmhouse sat alone on the horizon, a single shape against the snow. The yard was quiet, no dogs, no lights, only the crunch of boots and the wind through the cornstalks. They knocked once, no answer. The doorknob turned easily in the deputy's hand. And when they stepped inside, the kitchen was layered in years of neglect, newspapers stacked, tools left where a hand had put them down, dishes, and a stove that felt recently used. Sheriff Art Schley called Ed's name. No answer. They swept the rooms quickly and backed out. The deputies moved across the yard toward the outer buildings, a small shed behind the house first, and the barn if necessary. Their boots broke the crust of the fresh snow and their breath smoked in the flashlight beams. They opened the shed and those flashlights caught dust falling as it cut through the darkness. And then, horrifyingly, those flashlight beams ended the search for Bernice Worden. A radio call went out with 3 haunting words. "We found her." Worden's decapitated body was hung upside down by her legs from the rafters with a crossbar between her ankles and ropes around her wrists. Her torso had been dressed out like a deer. At that point, units rolled in from every direction, headlights cutting across the field until the yard was as bright as a work site. And Ed wasn't home. They would find him later that night in Plainfield, sitting quietly at a grocery store. He didn't fight, he didn't ask why. They cuffed him and brought him back. Through the night and into Sunday morning, officers documented the property under lanterns and portable lights. The inventory began in the shed and moved through the farmhouse, rooms sealed long ago, a Bible on the table in one of them, and the rest of the house collapsing into filth. They bagged and logged what the state crime lab would later list in one of Wisconsin's longest evidence catalogs, and it included, but was not limited to, whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket and several chairs made out of human skin, human skulls mounted on the bedposts, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from the shoulders to the waist, leggings made out of human leg skin, and masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, and Bernice Worden's whole head in a burlap sack. Also, Bernice Worden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove. There were also 9 female reproductive parts in a shoebox. The inventory also horrifyingly included a belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, and a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. Ballistics from a .32 caliber revolver were recovered in the house, matching the casing left years earlier on the floor of Mary Hogan's tavern. Piece by piece, the record closed, Bernice Worden's last receipt, the shed on Archer Road, the revolver in the kitchen drawer, and the artifacts spread across the farm. Reporters would call the Ed Gein farm a house of horrors, and most of the men who worked that night didn't use a name, and most of them never spoke about that night again. It was well past midnight when they set Ed Gein down in a small interview room in the Washara County Jail. The heater rattled outside, the town's few small street lamps burned against a hard November frost, and he looked tired, but calm. And when Sheriff Art Schley asked if he knew where Bernice Worden was, Ed simply said softly, "She's out at the farm." No protest, no confusion, just stating a fact, and the deputies took turns throughout the night. At first he denied shooting her, but then ultimately said, "I did," and his voice never changed pitch. When they asked why, he said he wasn't sure. He said he blacked out and wanted to keep her from leaving. He then began to mention Mother, the same name that had anchored every story he had told since 1945. By morning, he was transferred to the county seat at Watoma, where two investigators from the state crime lab recorded a formal statement. And it was there that he explained the cemetery trips, the magazines, the idea of building a suit so that he could be close to Mother again. He admitted to the killings of Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, though he insisted that both just happened. Within 48 hours, psychiatrists from the Central State Hospital were called in. Their notes describe him as cooperative, polite, sometimes smiling, and unable to grasp the seriousness of his acts. One even wrote that he seemed relieved to be caught. The court convened the following January, and the hearing only lasted a single day. Doctors from both sides agreed that Ed Gein was legally insane. He was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane and then later transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. There would be no jury, no sentencing, no prison term, just walls, routines, and endless evaluation. Now, over the next 2 decades, Ed was described as a model patient, quiet, helpful in the craft shop, fascinated by the Bible and the magazines around World War II. Reporters saw him decades later and said he looked like a small-town grandfather, polite and vaguely bewildered by all the attention. When asked if he regretted what he had done, he answered, "I don't know what I was doing back then." Ed died in July of 1984 at the age of 77, and he was buried beside his mother in the same Plainfield cemetery that had started it all. Ed's headstone has been stolen and recovered more than once, and the ground above it all still draws the curious. For Wisconsin, the case closed a long time ago, but for the rest of the world, it never really has. Now, by the winter of 1957, the story of the Plainfield butcher had crawled out of the Wisconsin snow and into every newspaper in America. Reporters wrote of a shy bachelor, a dead mother, a farmhouse full of horrors, and headlines screamed "House of Horror found in Plainfield." And just 35 miles away, in another small town, a writer named Robert Block sat at his desk reading those lines under a single lamp. Now, Block had already half-finished a manuscript about a lonely man and a mother he couldn't let go of long before Ed Gein's name had ever hit print. But now the newspapers were giving him a blueprint based in reality. And out of that came Norman Bates, the man polite behind the front desk and possessed behind closed doors. 2 years later, Alfred Hitchcock buys the rights to Block's little horror novel for $9,000, and he refused to let anybody know he was filming this movie, and he also told his actors not to read the last page. The cameras rolled on the cheap set, dressed like a farmhouse, the Bates home perched over a lonely motel, shadows climbing the staircase like vines. And in that house, Hitchcock distilled everything the headlines had hinted at: a son who could not bury his mother, and a voice that never stopped whispering in his ear. The corpse in the rocking chair, the knife in the shower, the trembling smile that can't decide which face it belonged to. Those weren't inventions so much as translations. Ed Gein's frozen devotion to his mother had turned into an art house nightmare. It was the first time a studio let audiences glimpse what happens when loneliness curdles into worship, when the human mind decides that death is just another form of company. And from there, the echoes of Ed Gein's story just kept spreading. Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, all sons of Plainfield's ghost. But the truth is, it all started with one real man in one real farmhouse, and the smell of decay on the Wisconsin wind. Hollywood may have dressed it up in black and white with violin screams, but the bones underneath were all the same. A lonely farm boy who couldn't let his mother die, and a world who couldn't look away once the door was open. You can still stand on that road outside Plainfield if you want to. The field's empty now, the house is long since torn down, there's nothing left but frost and silence and the ghosts of flashlights cutting through the dark. But if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear that Wisconsin wind drag across the boards of what used to be the farmhouse. The same wind that carried a deputy's shout, a sheriff's prayer, and the sound of a man quietly confessing to horrors too strange to believe. Ed Gein wasn't the devil hiding in the woods. He was the neighbor who fixed your fence, the man who carried your groceries, the one who nodded politely and said he'd see you Sunday. And that's the part that keeps people awake. Not the blood, not the crimes, but the quiet, the ordinary face of it. When they took him away that night, some said that they saw a kind of relief in his eyes. Maybe he was tired of pretending and living inside a house full of ghosts. And maybe for the first time since his mother's death, he didn't have to be alone anymore. So now, as the fire burns and the night settles back in around us, remember this: monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they keep to themselves, wave from the front porch, and just want to be left alone. Sometimes the scariest thing about a monster is how much he looks like everyone else. I am the Bad Hatter. Like and subscribe to this channel, and as always, steer clear of the shadows.